State recognize the presence of the jury.
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have a seat, everyone. Mr. Gillen, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. We're going to try to move through this, so I'll try to be as direct as I can so we can all, is it Miami you're headed to?
No, I'm local.
Oh, are you? Okay. All right, well, my name is Craig Gillen, and I don't believe we've met. I'm going to be asking you some questions.
Okay.
Now, you told us about several things. I'm going to try to break it down into different groups and ask you questions about that, and so we can work through this.
Okay.
One, you told us about a test that you ran that where you took the firearm, states 20, and you ran some tests firing it into a cotton twill fabric, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, and what you were attempting to do there is you were attempting to find out, at least from the ammunition that was projected out from the gun at that particular time, what the stippling patterns would be at different intervals of 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, correct?
That's correct.
Now, the one thing that we can be absolutely certain about is that this test cannot determine at all with absolute accuracy any distance between the muzzle and the target, correct?
That's correct.
And so what you're really doing here, just so that everyone understands, is you're really trying to get some sort of range because there are so many variables, correct?
That's correct.
And your position here today is not to give an opinion about what distance was the appropriate or your conclusion about a particular distance, right?
That's correct.
And the reason why that you, when you ran this test in what year did you run the test?
2011, I think.
Yeah, it was a long time after the September the 21st, 2009, wasn't it?
Yes.
Matter of fact, when you ran this test, what you did is there was a meeting of state officials down there at your lab. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Relevance?
Sustained.
Your Honor, I would like to find out who was there and what directions were given to him about how to run the test. And I believe that I should be able to go into that foundation.
You can ask him what direction he was given.
Well, by whom?
Just go ahead, Mr. Gillen.
Now, were you given any directions by the district attorney and an assistant district attorney and other members of law enforcement prior to giving your test?
Directions?
Or discussions about the test?
There was a discussion.
On how many occasions have you ever had the elected district attorney and an assistant district attorney come down and discuss a test with you prior to your conducting a test in your lab?
It's happened.
Objection.
Let me see the attorneys at this. Proceed, Mr. Gillen.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, what you did when you began the testing, and this was in, you said 2011, correct?
No, it's 2010.
Was it
I'm checking the notes.
2010? Do you remember the date? Have you been checking on the
It was
date?
in May of 2010.
Okay, May 2010 is when you did the test firings. And so what occurred is that you, first of all, you had the gun, which you testified about, correct?
Yes.
And I believe that's Exhibit 20. And what you had here is initially you took some ammo off the shelf that had been about 10 or 15 years old, correct?
No, actually we had to go out and buy some because we didn't have any in our collection.
So the collection you had there wasn't sufficient. You went out and went to some store and just bought ammo that you thought was similar to the ammo that was in the chambers of the gun, correct?
That's correct.
And as we know, or excuse me, strike that. So you bought the ammo at the store, did you do any analysis of any of the bullets that were from the chamber that had not yet been fired?
Yes.
Did you break them out chemically and look at the chemical composition?
No, we didn't break it down chemically. We just wanted to ensure that the gunpowder was the same kind of powder. Because that's the only variation you're going to see in commercially manufactured cartridges is the type of gunpowder that they use.
Did you check with the manufacturer to find out any more about the specifics of the particular shells, or excuse me, cartridges that you were buying from the store to do the test fire?
We didn't check with the manufacturer. All we had to do was examine it ourselves to see, and that's what I did.
Because as we know, even from one cartridge to another, you may have different pattern or different amounts of stippling coming out of that particular cartridge than the one sitting next to it in the same box, correct?
Yes, that can happen, but we checked to make sure that did not happen.
But, well, it's impossible to check for sure that it did not happen, right?
Well, you have a limited amount of ammunition to use, yes.
So what you did is you got what you thought was the best similar ammo, and that's what you used to run tests at 6, 12, 18, 24, and 30 inches, correct?
That's correct.
And what you did is you put and Your Honor, may I, what was the number on the?
What are you looking for? I can help you.
The
Off quills?
the cotton 12s. Is it 40? No, that's too bad.
42,
Right here, sir.
AA 42.
May I?
Yes, sir.
May I approach?
You may.
Hi. We're looking at what is numbered 1 here. And what range was that?
It was at 6 inches. Right down here, you see 6 inches of lab ammo.
Okay. And so what happened here is from 6 inches away, you fired directly into the cotton 12 from the gun, correct?
That's correct.
Now, one would assume that there would be an even distribution of stippling around the entry of where the bullet is, correct? Will you look at that, and will you agree with me that in number 1, which is the 6 inches, that there is a much higher concentration of stippling on sort of the northern part of the north of the entry area?
Yes.
So you just told us that, and would you look at some of the others and indicate that that was the same with some of the others as well, that there's not an equal distribution of stippling around the entry part of the bullet?
It's not perfectly equal, no.
Well, for example, in number 3 here, very much like in number 1, it's much more concentrated in the north, isn't it?
Yes. Well, what's happening is you're looking at the actual fabric samples that were used.
Correct.
The gunpowder particles are loosely adhered, and a lot of particles could be dislodged. So
Well-
we're not seeing the exact pattern that I used for the comparison.
Well, the pattern that we see here in this particular exhibit that I just showed you seem to have a pattern in and of itself, and that is that the stippling marks that will go out with a jury are asymmetrical, aren't they?
That can happen, yes.
Well, it happened here, didn't it?
Yes.
And so did you fire at an angle?
No.
Did you fire up or down?
Perpendicular. It was perpendicular to the surface.
So you can't explain to us why there is this asymmetrical pattern.
Well, I'm telling you, the powder particles could have dislodged. It's been years, and that's not the exact pattern that it may have been a more symmetrical pattern that I had for comparison.
Well, can you think of any reason why the same problem in each one of the exhibits would be the same? That is, there's an asymmetrical stippling marks sort of north of the entry, bullet entry area.
No.
When you were doing your testing, did you observe that and say that seems to be unusual?
No.
Now, when your job was not to reach any conclusion at all about your opinion about the distance that from the incident at the Ward home and the test that you fired in the cotton twilling, correct?
That's correct.
And one of the reasons why that is so is because when you conducted this examination in May of 2010, that your department didn't even have a written protocol for reaching such a conclusion, did it?
We stopped doing that determination.
Okay. My question is, in May of 2010, your department didn't even have a written protocol for someone like you to make a conclusion about that, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you indicated that what you did was you fired from the store, what I'll call store-bought ammo, you fired from 6, 12, 18, 24, and 30, correct?
That's correct.
And then you had your results.
Yes.
And then you made a subjective decision, did you not, to decide at what range that you would test fire 2 of the rounds from what we'll call the evidence rounds that came from the chamber of the gun at the Ward home, correct?
That's correct.
And what you did is that was a subjective decision that you made, and you decided that you would test it at 12 and 18 inches, correct?
That's correct.
And although you had another round that had not been spent that came from the Ward home, the chamber of the gun, States Exhibit 20, you did not test at 6 inches, did you?
No.
Now, you chose to test at 6 and 12 in 6-inch intervals rather than 3-inch intervals, for example.
Yes.
And is that because it's such a subjective matter in terms of the flexibility of variables that you just thought, we're really just looking for some kind of ballpark range, and so we'll do it at 6 inches?
Well, our purpose is to bracket the answer. And in a way, it's not really a ballpark. It's to get the least amount and the largest amount that it could not be. So if we're just going to bracket the answer, then having smaller increments is overkill.
Well, you could have had smaller answers, smaller sizes, and had something between 9 and, you could have bracketed 9 and 15 or something like that, correct?
Yeah, you could have, but you wouldn't get any better answer out of it.
You just decided to do it at the interval that you're talking about.
Yes.
Okay. Now, again, as we indicated, it's when you're doing a test like that, what you want to do is try to duplicate the environmental conditions as best you can, correct?
As best as you can, yes.
And obviously, the test was not conducted at the Ward home, correct?
That's correct.
But you did use the same gun. That's one of the factors you want to do if you have the opportunity, is to use the same gun. And you
And the
did.
same ammunition.
And similar ammunition.
Similar ammunition.
Now, a stippling pattern, as you indicated, is sort of this unignited hot powder.
Well, not really. It could be partially ignited. It could be partially burned powder. It could be totally unburned powder. It's a combination of everything, but it is the residual powder particle that creates the stippling impact.
Okay.
Point.
Now, when you conducted your test, did you examine the cotton sheets with a magnifying glass?
Actually, they were examined with a stereo microscope.
And did you do that?
Yes.
Okay. And so, did you have any results, or did you write up anything in terms of your analysis of your examination of the cotton twill?
No, just that the type of powder that was projected to make sure that the powder was the same in all tests.
So what you were doing wasn't really to look for any specific unidentified from the eye stippling on the cotton, but rather to determine that the type of powder that was used on the test firing was the same as the type powder that you believe was used from the evidence from the gun. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, another matter that you testified about. Let's talk a little bit about, you explained to us what GSR is, and you talked about the smoke and this kind of vapor, correct?
That's correct.
And how it can come out, and I think you said a cloud, right?
Yes.
And that can get on a person's hands and clothes as well, correct?
That's correct.
And you can test clothes to determine whether there's GSR in them, can't you?
Theoretically, you can, but it's not something that's done on a routine basis.
Theoretically, you can, but it's not done on a regular basis. But
No.
it can be done, right?
Yes, it can be.
Sure. You talked a little bit about the this test that you did with the agent down there, correct?
Yes.
And so were you the person who did the GSR on her?
Yes.
Now,
I actually did the collection from her hands.
now that test was really to just find out whether or not that particular gun, number 20, actually produced GSR, isn't that correct?
Yes.
So what you're doing is when you have a gun like this in number 20, you just want to find out, hey, is it like the other guns of similar nature? Does it produce GSR, correct?
Well, it's more correctly, it's not does it produce GSR, but does it deposit GSR on the hands of the shooter?
Okay. So you weren't really, the point of it is that the sole purpose of the test down there on the agent was just to find out whether it produced GSR and on somebody's hands, correct?
Correct.
Now, you talked a little bit about cocking. You don't have to cock this gun, correct?
That's correct.
There's no safety on this gun, is there?
No.
In other words, some guns, as we know, have safeties where if you turn the button up, then the gun isn't going to go off unless the safety is released, correct?
Well, actually, there is an internal safety, but there is no, what you're referring to as a manual safety. There's no manual safety. There are internal safeties built into the gun, though.
But there's no manual safety on this gun.
That's correct.
Okay. And so when you pull the trigger, it's going to, you pull it and it's going to go off if you pull it with sufficient force, correct?
Assuming there's ammunition in it.
Right. Yes. If there's ammunition in it, you pull the trigger.
Unfired ammunition.
Yeah,
in it.
exactly. And it is, now, you testified about also about a, you testified that you did a test on the, to measure the pull on the gun, correct?
Yes, I did.
And so you did that with weights, is that right?
Yes, dead weights.
Now, that is really not kind of what happens in real life, is it?
You mean that doesn't, it's not exactly the way a trigger is pulled?
It's not exactly the way a trigger is pulled, correct?
No, it's not exactly, no.
And it's also not exactly, when you talk about in terms of pressure, what test did you do to measure how much a grip pressure would be necessary for the gun to go off? Did you do that?
I didn't do that test.
Okay, so you didn't do, and when we're talking about a grip pressure, what I'm referring to is that if you grab a gun and you've got a force where your hand, where you're pulling and you're pushing also from your hand, correct?
Yes.
And so when you have a grip pressure on, it's the strength of one's grip. And can you measure that?
We don't have any instruments to measure that, no.
Now, the strength of one's grip, it may be measured in pounds per square inch or pounds of force. Is there a different kind of thing than lifting a static weight? Would you agree with that?
It is a different thing.
So
I'll agree with that.
So the grip pressure on the force of kind of pulling a trigger with your hand is much different than a static weight that you did the test on, right?
Yes, yes. It's a little different.
Just one moment, Your Honor, I want to.
You just put the gun in their hands.
That's all I have.
Redirect.
Thank you.
Have you ever heard the saying that there are no two snowflakes that are alike?
Yes, I have.
Not the politically derogatory term, the ice crystals.
Right.
Is that fair to say that there's no two rounds of ammunition that are alike as far as their gunpowder? I mean, exactly similar, like he was saying during cross.
I don't know how to answer that.
Okay.
I really don't.
Well, let's take it to the patterns. No two patterns will be exactly alike.
Oh, if you're talking about the pattern in the actual placement of the powder particles, yes, that's correct. They're never identical because
And
it's a random deposition. The powder particles, when they're deposited on the fabric, is a random deposition.
And so there's no computer that automatically goes and quantitates, you know, a certain amount of particles per a certain square area. Is that right?
No.
It's ultimately a subjective call by somebody with experience in the area?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in the last part of the cross-examination, I believe he was going into that trigger weights is no substitute to pulling the trigger of the gun, because you got to grip it.
It's a little different, yes.
And so would you agree that there's really no substitute for understanding the trigger pull without doing it?
That's, in the sense that's true. You mean to really understand the force behind the trigger pull, you actually have to pull it yourself, but that doesn't really get to the fact of why we do trigger pulls with a dead weight system.
Okay. No other questions of this witness, Judge?
And so it's be excused.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you very much. All right, sir, you are free to go. Thank you.
May we approach?
Yes. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to recess for the evening. Same admonishment as always. Don't watch TV. Don't read. Don't look at the internet about anything that might be related to this case. Enjoy your evening. We are going to start at 9:30 tomorrow morning. I have a matter I have to handle prior to this. All my other stuff doesn't stop because of my trial, and I don't want you sitting around. So meet the deputies downstairs at 9:15, and tomorrow only we're going to stop at 4 o'clock. All right? I see some excitement on some faces. Have a good evening. We'll see you guys back tomorrow morning. Thanks.
Your Honor, we are asking this court to allow the firearm to be in the jury room for deliberations, obviously without ammunition. The case law is Lamb, L-A-M-B versus State, 107 Southern, 530, Florida Supreme Court, 1925. Normally, everything in evidence goes back to the jury room. Cliff Berry Incorporated versus State, 116 Southern 3rd, 394, Florida 3rd DCA, 2012. Error to not let important exhibit go back. Obviously, in that case, it was a document, not this, so I understand the difference. But the general rule, the general law is evidence should go back to the jury room. Why else do we put things into evidence but for the jury to examine and carefully consider all of this evidence so that they can weigh the credibility of what witnesses have said about this evidence? And in particular, this notion that, you know, this is an experiment or a test, it's just ordinary examination of evidence so that they can consider the credibility of what the witnesses have said about this evidence. The counter danger to not allowing everybody to have the opportunity to handle this firearm is that this case gets tried by the one or two people on that jury who have handled that particular firearm or the couple of people or the handful of people who have handled and fired firearms. It's just like the questions we asked all throughout jury selection. What relevant life experiences do you bring to this table? And firearms experience was something that we both explored for some time, perhaps me more than them, but there's nothing improper about this. I haven't seen anything in the case law that makes this improper. And the case law on this subject matter involves drugs going back to the jury, involves all sorts of different things going back to the jury. And that's why we have juries. That's why we enter things into evidence, is for them to examine these things and test their validity and weigh it, just like they weigh the testimony of witnesses. And so that's why we're asking for it, obviously, to be able to go back so that they can test it without the pressure of us staring at them, just like they had that opportunity in the first trial. But at the very least, if there's some sort of safety concern that exists now that did not in 2011, they should be able to examine the firearm without it being locked in the jury box with a deputy protecting us all from them.
Your Honor, this has come on us very quickly. Counsel has cited some cases. We would ask for the opportunity to research and write a brief. We could probably do it within 24 hours.
As long as your brief is brief. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, your objection, I need you to put, Mr. Gillen, on the record what your objection is at this point.
At this point, my objection is I object to the gun either going back into the jury room during deliberations or to have them in the jury box, as also is asked by the prosecution, because that would be, in essence, asking the jury to conduct its own experiment.
What experiment is it you think the jury is conducting?
The experiment on the weapon of pulling and testing, that's an experiment. And so we would like the opportunity to brief it.
Why do you believe that pulling the trigger on the weapon that all parties concede is the one that caused the fatal shot to Mrs. Ward would be an experiment?
Well,
and let me ask you this, unless I've misunderstood you, and I listened carefully to both openings, the defense's theory is this was a horrible accident. And therefore, why would the jury not be allowed to examine the ease with which this weapon can be fired?
What I've stated, Your Honor, and this is my initial reaction to this issue, and as I said, I'd like to brief it and supplement our objections, but right now, my objection is it's improperly allowing the jury to conduct its own experiments, and I would like the opportunity to submit a brief on the matter.
I'm be happy to give you the opportunity to submit. I mean, I will tell you that normally in Florida, a jury is allowed to examine any piece of evidence which they request. For safety reasons, we never send a gun and bullets back to them. And when we send a gun back, it's usually locked. But as with all situations, I have to base my ruling on the facts of each particular case. But you've asked for additional time to brief this, granted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And the one issue is this jury hasn't asked anything. They haven't requested anything. It's the prosecution.
They're not in deliberations
I
yet.
understand, but the court said that if a jury asks for evidence, but in any event, I appreciate it, and we'll brief it and get back with you, and thank you so much for that,
right.
the opportunity to write about it.
All right, folks, we're in recess until the trial will resume at 9:30 tomorrow morning.